Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. So much love to each and every one of you. I really appreciate all my subscribers and I hope you're all doing remarkably well and that you are going to get that perfect glass of drink, because whatever it is that you drink, and if it's unusual, I want to know all about it. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it was in the 1960s, the birthplace of popular culture in the film and music industry, that certainly reflected the decade's upheavals with the Cold War, civil rights movements, students' protests, and of course the Vietnam War. Yet despite all those uprisings, the swinging 60s was indeed a great time to be alive, and the music in those days was exceedingly good, as on the 5th of October 1952, the Beatles' song Love Me Do first hit the airwaves, and there was no looking back after that. I was about 16 years old at the time, living with both my parents and my younger sister Dawn on a small plot of rural land in the Pacific Northwest. Our whimsical cottage-style home was both quaint and pretty, possibly not too dissimilar to what you might find in the English countryside, as my mother's English ancestry certainly influenced her style and, of course, the layout of our home, with its whitewashed bricked walls and large French windows that invited an airy brightness into our home that decided it was never going to leave. We had a very bright pink front door and rambling yellow and pink roses that climbed up the walls with an ethereal grace. I guess you could say our home was one among many cottage-style homes of its kind in the local area, all conveniently located about 10 minutes away from town. I loved our small quaint town with its twee architecture, because it had a quintessential old-world vintage feel about it, even back in those days in the 60s, and it was oozing with so much character and charm, whilst the streets were always lined with beguiling window boxes, both in summer and spring, full of colourful blooms and pretty flowers. Many visitors to our part of the world were seemingly enchanted by the bedazzling town that overlooked picturesque mountainous views and offered them a large selection of choices from hiking, cycling and horse-riding trails, along with scenic vistas of tall statuesque Douglas firs and logpole pines scattered liberally throughout the countryside. Then there were flowering meadows, farmers' fields and lakes, creeks, ponds, and even gravel pits that provided our visitors with bountiful pleasures for their eyes to feast upon, much like a king's banquet. Ours was an amiable town with congenial southern hospitality and warm convivial people. And as kids we would visit the local diner frequently, where our parents would treat us to waffles with maple syrup and vanilla ice cream, and of course the best double thick chocolate malt milkshakes that you've ever tasted in your life, that they certainly seem incapable of replicating today. I liked all the people in town, and some more than others, and as kids Mr. Papadopoulos was our all-time favourite adult, as he was a man with a great presence and incredible charm that everybody just loved. He was the type of person who could walk into a room and everybody would notice him, and even perfect strangers would gravitate towards him like bees around a honeypot, especially in awkward social situations, as if anyone could put you at ease and make you feel relaxed, it was Mr. Papadopoulos. Ironically, he owned a funeral parlour in town that was a generational family business, and he knew how to deal with his grieving clients with so much sensitivity and tact. I remember he possessed the most exquisite Shire horses that you've ever seen, with the loveliest temperaments, and boy did I love those horses. If that wasn't enough, he also owned a couple of very opulent, grandiose carriages that certainly wouldn't have looked out of place driving down Buckingham Palace Road towards Chelsea. Mr. Papadopoulos hired out these opulent carriages for funerals and weddings alike. He would often give my sister and I free rides around the town in one of his horse-drawn carriages, and we would wave to people as we trotted past them, and they would wave back, admiring the pomp and ceremony of the occasion, which for us was an ordinary day that had suddenly morphed into something really spectacular and showy. I always felt like Cinderella for the day, proudly riding in that chariot up and down the streets of our town. Mr. Papadopoulos was quite an eccentric, aristocratic type of individual, and dressed as such, bearing the distinct hallmarks of a distinguished Victorian gentleman by embracing the quintessential top hat and tails in his daily wardrobe regime, along with the shiniest shoes that I've ever seen in my life. And he even possessed one of those fancy old-fashioned pocket watches that he would use to check the time. I warmed to this gregarious, effervescent, sparkling gentleman who had the most cheerful brown robin redbreast eyes and sported a very long, full walrus-style moustache which had earned him first place in a local competition, something he was exceedingly proud about. I believed he looked after that moustache with such meticulous care, and even boasted that he had a specialised comb for his walrus. One pleasant morning, as my sister and I, along with my mother, were exiting the local bakery, where the delicious, sweet, rich, spicy smells of cinnamon and butter permeated the air with its robust, lush, mouth-watering fragrances. Certainly on this occasion, like so many locals who cannot resist buying the famous cinnamon bread, we left the bakery respectively armed with sizable brown paper bags filled with freshly baked cinnamon bread, bagels, caramel doughnuts, and gingerbread men. We bumped into Mr. Papadopoulos, and our spirits lifted immeasurably from the very moment we saw him. "By Jove," he said, smiling at us brightly with a warm, infectious grin that could most certainly have melted the hardest ice. "It's good to see 3 very beautiful ladies out this morning. Why, I do believe the day has become infinitely more brighter, and there must be about to be a rainbow bursting out into the sky." My mother flushed a bright pink colour. "Mr. Papadopoulos, if you continue to flatter us any more, our egos will be far too big to be able to fit back into our car," she teased. "Oh, well, it's awfully good to see you all this morning. Oh, did you hear about poor Felicity Potter? It's a dreadful business, and such a pitiful shame, if you ask me." "No," said my mother, gasping in astonishment, for she knew the Potters well, and Felicity had always been a good friend of the family's, even though she was about 6 years older than I was. "Felicity," said my mother, "has something happened to her?" "She's completely vanished off the face of the earth," said Mr. Papadopoulos, looking very aggrieved. "I gather she was meeting her boyfriend out here in town. Very agreeable fellow he was, too. Well-spoken and polite. I believe they had dinner together at the Italian restaurant. You know, the new one in town, run by that rather dapper gentleman from Naples. The food is so excellent there, and I've been meaning to take the wife for ages, as I gather the spaghetti carbonara is quite extraordinary. Anyway, I was told that the boyfriend escorted Felicity back to her white Beetle and kissed her goodbye. I believe she made the short journey home and was never seen again. It's a bizarre case, and the sheriff, well, he's very befuddled by the situation, as there's no trace of Felicity nor her car." "What about the boyfriend?" whispered my mother, lowering the tone of her voice in case anyone could hear her. "Are you sure he hasn't got something to do with her disappearance? You know what they say, Mr. Papadopoulos, about murders. They're closer to home than you might actually think." Mr. Papadopoulos stroked his walrus moustache reflectively, almost as if it was a lovable cat. "Well, from what I've learnt, the boyfriend has a squeaky clean reputation, according to the sheriff. Very nice lad, too. Devastated about Felicity's disappearance, for it seems that the two of them were beginning to talk wedding bells." "Oh, my word," said my mother, gasping. "How is Maureen taking it? I can't imagine. I mean, she and Felicity were so close. I can't imagine as a mother what it would do if my 2 daughters, or even one of them, vanished. It would tear me apart. Maureen's not doing very well, I'm afraid, said Mr. Papadopoulos. I've been asked to do a memorial service for her daughter, on her behalf, of course, and I'm going to throw out all the pomp and ceremony for the occasion, free of charge, with the Shire horses and carriages dancing down our streets. How very thoughtful of you, said my mother. It's certainly a lovely idea, and very kind of you, but isn't it a little premature? I mean, can you really be sure that Felicity is dead? I mean, you do hear of teenagers doing runners. Not Felicity, sighed Mr. Papadopoulos. She was a true homebody if I ever saw one. I'm afraid Maureen believes her daughter has truly gone. And I have to agree with her. I think she's right. A girl like that, with so much to live for, does not vanish off the face of the earth, unless she has met some kind of grisly fate. Felicity was in the prime of her life, with her whole future mapped out before her. None of this makes any sense at all. Even so, said my mother, I still think it's premature to assume the worst, especially if her VW Beetle hasn't even been recovered yet. As you can imagine, in our small town, everyone was aghast about what had happened to Felicity, and for a while my parents didn't want us to go cycling around the countryside on our own, or even riding our neighbours' horses, as they were exceedingly fearful that something untoward might actually happen to us. And some of the residents, filled with fear, were locking their front doors every single night, for many emphatically believed that there was a prowling human predator lurking in our midst, that was responsible for the heinous murder and duplicitous abduction of Felicity Potter, and the question on many people's minds was who would be next. Now remember, said my mother, warning us tirelessly over and over again, to such an extent that she began to sound like a broken record, never ever talk to strangers or accept sweets or cool drinks from anybody you don't know. Do you understand? Yes, mother, we would say. One day my mother had invited some friends over to tea. As in those days, tea parties were quite customary among the local women, and all took turns to host a tea party about twice a week. It was an informal, happy gathering, where the girls would somehow get together for fun and social interaction. Who's coming to tea? I asked my mother, as I watched her bustling around her vintage green kitchen with its white cabinets, rather like a busy bee, making salmon and cucumber sandwiches and placing Chelsea buns, chocolate brownies and apple and custard doughnuts onto a silver tray, along with her delicate periwinkle china from which she intended to serve out piping hot cups of English breakfast tea. The living room always looked very cosy and warm, with walls painted in a bright turquoise and white couches scattered with brown and gold scatter cushions, and a crackling fire burning away happily in the marble fireplace. It wasn't long before 8 women were drinking piping hot cups of tea and nattering away about all kinds of trivia, and invariably in a trice I could hear them discussing the Felicity Potter case, which was the highlight of town gossip. Dreadful business, said one of the women called Dorothy. I'm afraid to go to sleep at night, knowing that there's a monster lurking around there that's responsible for killing Fiona. The question, who is he? That's what I want to know. Talking about monsters, came Susan Evington's voice. Did you hear about what happened to Mr. Doyle last Tuesday night? Horrible, horrible story, she said, contorting her face in disgust. I can't even get my head around it. I could hear the room go very silent and become ominously still, as all ears listened intently to Susan's story, with every eye in the room focused on her every single word. Well, I've known Mr. Doyle now for many long years, and I assure you he's a man of distinction and honour. He's not inclined to make up fraudulent, bogus claims, but what he told me is hard to digest and take on board, but I'm inclined to believe his account, as preposterous and outlandish as it sounds. Now, Mr. Doyle has been lodging with us for 15 years now. He's become like a member of my family, and yes, I will admit he has the odd glass of port from time to time, as he reckons it keeps his rheumatism at bay. On Tuesday night, He left our house at about 6 o'clock and went to play bridge with old Mr. Riley. And yes, they did have the odd tipple together. I'm not going to deny that, of course. Anyway, he was on the local bridge road. He was driving back his Chevy Corvette at the time. You know, the one over the lake on the way home. That was when he saw it. Saw what? Asked all the women at once, in an elevated chorus of voices. The monster, of course, said Susan. He told me that at first he thought he was hallucinating because he may have had one drink too many, but he always handles his drink remarkably well, and knew that what he was seeing was real, and wasn't a result of a hallucinogenic intoxication. This thing was grotesque, hideously ugly, but built exactly like a man in its humanoid shape, and it towered at 6 foot tall and stood up on 2 feet like a man. It possessed a head rather like that of a wolf or a dog, and it was covered in grey hair, and it grimaced at Mr. Doyle with a discomposing death stare and malevolent eyes that were traffic light red, and it growled at him like a ruthless, vicious, savage dog. Mr. Doyle said he avoided looking into the blazing red eyes because he said they were almost hypnotic. He was trembling so much as he drove back, and this thing was running alongside his Chevy. He perceived the mysterious beast to be much more intelligent and calculating than a dog, but he said this thing was evil, cold-blooded and diabolical. Of course, when he got home, he was too scared and intimidated to get out of his Chevy, in case the sadistic, depraved dog or creature, whatever it was loitering around there in the bushes, hoping to pounce on him unawares. It was a very cold night, but Mr. Doyle refused to come out of the Chevy until the sun set over the horizon. He's now too terrified to go out on that bridge road at night again, and hasn't played bridge since. I'm really sorry, said my mother. I don't mean to be rude, she said, shaking her head vigorously. But Susan, you're asking us to believe in something so farcical and harebrained. I mean a human dog-like creature, really, that seems humanoid and stands on 2 legs. That's preposterous. You can't surely expect us to believe that. Well, I know Mr. Doyle really well, insisted Susan, and he wouldn't make this up. He's a very unassuming man who does not like to draw attention to himself. He's actually quite shy, really. I believe him, said Margaret. I seem to remember my grandfather talking about such a creature, and I remember that when I visited Egypt not too long ago, there were pictures of men in hieroglyphics with heads like wolves, which were wearing skirts, which may suggest these creatures have been around for centuries. Eavesdropping on the conversation that was progressing, I was predisposed to agree with my mother, and although I liked Mr. Doyle very much indeed, I wasn't inclined to believe in his ludicrous claims and overtop story that bordered on the insanely bizarre to the downright nonsensical, until one night, that is, when my mother and I had an encounter with the mythical beast ourselves, and the experience certainly shifted and transposed our view of reality completely, making us brazenly aware that this inexplicable, enigmatical world is not what it seems. It was during the night when my family had long since retired to bed, and were awoken to the loud, inauspicious, baleful ringing sound of the telephone. And at that time of the night, you always feared the worst. Was someone dead, I wondered in horror, as who would phone us at this late hour of the night? I could hear my parents talking together in hushed, urgent tones, and I tiptoed towards my parents' bedroom to listen in on their conversation. By this time, my heart was thundering violently in my chest, as I wondered what could have possibly happened. It had to be something terribly bad, surely. "But you can't go now," protested my father. "Look at the time. It's 12:30 at night. It's a ridiculous hour to be going." "I can't leave her without any migraine medication," my mother piped. "We're both inclined to get thundering headaches like this from time to time. I don't expect you to understand unless you've experienced one for yourself. Every second that your head thumps, it's quite unbearable and insufferable. I want to drop off these pills to her at once. I promise you she would do exactly the same if the tables were turned. These pills are the only thing that are going to work for her, to lessen and reduce the pain and the dreadful nausea." "Very well," said my father. "You can go, but don't be long. and don't leave me hanging. I'm not happy about you going out at late like this." Relief washed over me like a reassuring warm shower, and I bolted into my parents' room, tightening my dressing gown around my slender frame. "Can I come with you, Mum?" I begged. "Why not?" said my mother. "I could certainly do with the company." The journey to my grandmother's was quick and brief. She was relieved to get the pills, and swallowed them at once. We stayed with her for a short while, offering her a measure of reassurance, until the throbbing pain began to subside and reduce, because the pills work efficiently. "Oh, thank you, sweetheart," said my grandmother, taking her daughter's hand in hers and looking lovingly into her eyes. "My head was pounding so violently. It was so kind of you to think of me. Truly, I thought it would explode. Thank you for coming out all this way at such a late hour. You've truly saved my life." At last my grandmother looked decidedly more perky, sanguine and upbeat, and then, feeling heartily relieved and reassured by the vast improvement in her health, we quickly made our way back home in the back of our mustard-coloured Shelby Cobra. It certainly was terribly fun being wrapped up in my cosy warm pyjamas and dressing gown in the back of the car, and passing undulating fields of cows grazing happily in the pastures, along with pretty mountainous outcrops, barns and farmhouses during what was the witching hours of the night, even though the views without any street lights seemed almost disturbingly spectral and menacing, despite the presence of a full moon and a scattering of silvery stars that brought a measure of illumination to the dusky darkness. As our car approached the bridge, I sensed that everything seemed to have become dingy and oppressive. That was when we discerned the shadowy silhouette of a monstrous, malignant creature, and it was, without doubt, the most haunting, terrifying, creepy thing that I have ever beheld in my entire life. Could this thing be real? Surely not. Or was my imagination teasing and taunting me, I wondered, making me see things that clearly were not actually there? I so badly wanted this to be the case, but I knew that this was no trick of the light. My blood went as cold as ice, and a dreadful chill ran down the back of my spine as the demonical, light-footed creature lunged towards us with a malevolent ambition. Our car seemed as fragile as a water bubble that could so easily pop and burst open, and like scant protection for this tormenting, sprightly beast that was powerful and strong, it carried itself with a straight deportment, only enhanced by its agile, acrobatic grace. I noticed its powerful talons on the edge of its hands looked razor-sharp and very threatening, so much more, rather reminding me of a tin opener, and our car seemed like a can of jellied ham that he intended to snap and prise open. "Oh, my God!" cried my mother. "Oh, my God! The bloody thing! It's real! Oh, my God!" I could see my mother trembling. Her face had grown an ashen white, and I could hear her heart thundering violently in her chest alongside my own, and her breathing intensified in its quickness. "Move the car, Mum! Move the car now!" I cried. "Mum, wake up! Move the car! Mum, what's wrong with you? Move the car!" But my mother was uncooperative to my desperate pleading urges, and seemed locked up in a state of suspended shock. I could see the devilish creature very clearly. His body was almost human, but the wedge-shaped head was very defined like a wolf, with pointed ears and a muzzle as long as the skull. The lips were black and close-fitting, the nose was dark, whilst the jaw was just aligned with very sharp, formidable canine teeth. The creature intentionally displayed them to us for the purposes of subduing and intimidating us. He growled, and the low guttural sound that emanated from the back of his deep throat was so distressing that our car began to rattle and vibrate from our very own trembling. This esoteric, beastly, ambiguous thing had substantial, razor-sharp cutting talons that he ran along the length of our car and used to scratch on my passenger door, which he began to try to yank open, and I began to scream and scream and scream. I could see my mother was completely transfixed and mesmerized by the creature's red eyes, and it was like they bored into her like a pistol-grip drill. and held her in a pronounced hypnotic trance from which she could not escape. In a matter of what seemed like seconds, my mother seemed to be driving our car precariously towards the edge of the bridge. What was she doing? Was she going crazy or something? It was almost as if she was being guided by a pair of unseen hands. Oh my goodness, we were now in perilous danger, for it would seem with a single jolt to the left or right, our car would ultimately lose suspension, and we would invariably be tipping over into the lake, plunging, sinking, and slipping into its murky depths. And the pitch-black darkness would greet us, welcoming us to our new abode, this bitterly cold, watery grave. "Stop!" I screamed. "Stop, Mum!" I said, pulling up the handbrake as hard as I possibly could, and stepping down on the brake. All of a sudden, a large, hair-covered, shadowy creature ran swiftly towards our car, yanking it forcefully away from the edge of the bridge with a seamless grace, using its powerful overlong arms and hands, and replacing our car back into the middle of the road. I saw there were 3 of these strange humanoid beings. They had human-like faces and furrowed brow ridges, leathery dark complexions, and deep-set dark eyes. They were covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair, and looked like wild, primitive men, although there were indeed some ape-like influences to their appearance, namely in the arms and the low-slung arch shape of the head that seamlessly appeared to fold into the shoulders with no apparent evidence of a neck. I could see there was no love lost between the wolf-like beast and these wild men, as they seemed like arch-rivals, and the hatred that they expressed between each other was immense, and was so tangible you could actually feel it. The wolf-like humanoid, with its muted grey colouring and bushy tail, became even more antagonistic and aggressive towards these humanoid creatures. He lashed out fearlessly towards them, growling, snarling, scratching, and making a high-pitched yelping sound that reminded me of a coyote. The fearless beast, with its egocentric, narcissistic characteristics, was not scared to put up a big, bold fight, even if it meant surrendering to a brutal death, for this creature was haughty, smug, and exceedingly arrogant. But he was outnumbered by the daunting size of the wild men, who were much more powerfully built than he was, each probably weighing a 700 pounds, and having the brute strength of a sizable beast like a rhino. I promise you this, the ground reverberated, trembled, and even moaned, as all 3 wild men growled at the beast, and then pounced upon his body, standing upon him with their oversized feet, pinning him down beneath their muscular legs, trampling him with the sheer intensity of their crushing weight, that culminated in the sounds of bones pulverizing, crackling, and snapping like bubble wrap. The painful, anguished yelps of the wolf-like beast faded into the night as it finally surrendered to its deadly fate. Then there was stillness, as everything became so quiet and subdued that you could have heard a pin drop. For a moment all 3 wild men stood as still as statues, their eyes connecting with each other in a meaningful dialogue in which no words were expressed or spoken. I watched in horror as one of these gallant, lofty humanoid beasts tossed the body of the wolf-like humanoid into the depths of the lake, as if it was the most disgusting piece of trash that completely repulsed them. The 3 wild men danced jubilantly under the light of the moon, and their dancing was not much different to yours or mine. They were making happy whooping sounds, for they were delighted to have defeated a long-despised foe, who they held in so little regard. For a while the creatures almost forgot their viewing audience back at the car, and then 3 sets of eyes so gentle and kind stared in at us with expressions of grave concern. I mean, these creatures were formidable, intimidating, and even scary to behold, but I know that there wasn't a bad bone in their colossal bodies. I'm in no doubt they were checking to see if we were all right, and despite their obvious reticence and elusiveness, they genuinely cared about our well-being. And I think, being all male, they were protective towards us being female. I know it sounds crazy, but I certainly felt their shielding energy envelop us, much like that of a loving father, who would do anything to save his children. I think without any manner of exaggeration, the love these lofty, majestic, intimidating creatures exuded towards us really was profound. Even my mother is in agreement of this fact, for she too would describe experiencing the gentle, solicitous chivalry of these powerful beasts that I now know to be Bigfoot. And although others may not have had positive interactions with these strange creatures, our experience has led us to believe that not all apples are the same from the barrel. I believe these beings would have gone out of a limb to save any other human in distress, like a brother or a sister. We watched the creatures gliding away into the woods beyond the bridge that fringed the lake, and as they moved their arms swung like people engaging in a power walk, and their pace was fast and efficient, and then they were gone from our sight. For a moment my mother and I sat still in silence. We said nothing, for indeed there was nothing to say. We were lost in a world of our own making, trying desperately to make sense of what had actually transpired. Truly for us it felt as if two beings from another world had entered our reality. And then we began to realize that there is a lot more going on in the forests of North America than previously meets the eye. I suppose it rarely makes sense, for so much of America is certainly unexplored wilderness. My mother and I made a pact that we wouldn't tell anyone what we had seen that night. I mean, what would be the point? Who would actually believe us? My father did wonder why my mother's car was so scratched up, but we told him nothing. He was so cynical and sceptic. My mother wasn't desirous to try and persuade him about what we'd seen, so she decided to say nothing at all. "I don't understand," he complained. "You went on a trip to drop off a few pills with your mother and returned from your journey with a car so scratched up, with no explanation as to why. It certainly doesn't make any sense at all," he said, looking confounded. "You're right," my mother said. "There are some things in life that make no sense at all, but we have to learn to live with those mysteries." In my book, those were poignant words. My mother left an anonymous note with the sheriff telling him that the body of Felicity Potter would be found under the lake. My mother said that she was sure of that fact because of the hypnotizing effects of the wolf-like beast on her that had made her fall under his manipulative spell. Henceforth a diving team was recruited by the force, and 2 cars with dead bodies were indeed found submerged at the bottom of the lake. One was never identified. My mother and I believe that these 2 female individuals had dubious encounters with the wolf-like humanoid. If it hadn't been for the bold, certain intervention of the 3 creatures called Bigfoot, we would definitely be lying at the bottom of that lake, and people would be saying, "What happened to the Macy's?" as like Felicity Potter, they vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. So there you are. That's my story. What a fabulous story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.